Today, I'm going to move on to talk about the rise of the British Empire, which I guess the early stages of the British Empire really start with the Tudor dynasty. You can probably start with King Henry VIII and, of course, Queen Elizabeth I, who we'll talk a lot about today. And I'll get some into the Stuart dynasty that comes into the 17th century as well. Anyway, like I said, I'll be moving on to talk about, of course, the British Empire, the rise of the British Empire today. Of course, you can see all the different famous flags that were associated with the British Empire, which at one point, the British Empire was based everywhere. It was pretty much one of the largest empires in the world at one point. See, of course, the British flag on the left, the so-called Union Jack, which, of course, well known. So you can see the British were everywhere, like pretty much Australia, New Zealand, North America, with Canada, also, of course, Africa, India, Asia, and so on. And, of course, even in the Americas, like Central America, South America, of course, as well. So pretty much they were pretty much everywhere overall. Now, you can see the map showing you the British Empire. If you look at the British today, which is amazing about, the United Kingdom itself is that, it now includes mostly majority England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, which, by the way, is only about 93,600 square miles. So it's amazing that this state was able to basically just, conquer, control so much territory over time. So it's a few centuries overall. Now you can see this vastness of the empire at one point. They used to say that the sun never sets on the British Empire, which is true. It peaked at about 13,700,000 square miles at one point. If you want the kilometers, it's 35 million square kilometers, which pretty much peaked in the 1920s. Was the time. So you can see 1.25% of the Earth's total land area was controlled by them. So that's definitely one of the largest in the world at one point. Like 1922 is believed to be the peak year when the empire reached its largest size. So 1922, about 458 million people lived under the British Empire at one point, 1/4 of the world population. You can see there's some other empires that also came close. Mongol Empire, you can see 33 million square miles at one point, kilometers. That's kilometers, actually. And Russian Empire was 22 million kilometers at one point, just to kind of give you an idea of the different empires that were there at one point. George V, I think, was the monarch at the time when, of course, the British Empire reached its peak. Today, now a part of some of those countries are still now part of the so-called Commonwealth, as they called it, also as well. Now, I'm going to get into today and talk about, of course, the so-called Tudor dynasty. The Tudor dynasty is really, one of the first dynasties that really lead into, of course, the British Empire later. I'll talk about, the different monarchs that were part of the Tudor dynasty. We'll, of course, mostly talk about Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, because those two were really the most famous monarchs that were part of that dynastic period that we'll kind of get into today. You can see here, by the way, the family tree of the Tudor dynasty. Now, of course, Henry VII was the founder, usually called Henry Tudor. Of course, his wife, Queen Consort Elizabeth of York. He had several children, but of course, the most famous that survived was Henry VIII, who, of course, would be later king after he would die. And then he had, of course, 3 children that would also be monarchs: Mary I, or Mary Tudor, Elizabeth I, then Edward VI. You see there. And then, of course, you see famously, the so-called wives of Henry VIII are also included in that family tree as well. Only the first 3, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, of course, gave him many children for Henry VIII overall. A little bit about Henry VIII, of course. If you know about Henry VIII, he was, of course, a king that was the son of Henry VII. Henry VII supposedly founded the Tudor dynasty at the end of the War of the Roses. That was a kind of a civil war that occurred at the end of the Middle Ages in England between the different families that were in the Plantagenet dynasty, which the Plantagenet dynasty was a famous English medieval dynasty that went back to the time of the Crusades and all that. They had these two rival families, the Lancasters and the Yorks, and if you know about it, they had these two different roses in their coat of arms. The Lancasters had a red rose, the Yorks had a white rose. And Henry seized power in 1485 and ruled till 1509. He's often called Henry Tudor, and then, of course, they were known as the Tudors, of course, afterwards. But, of course, more famously, the Tudors would reign, by the way, over 1 century. So 1485 to about 1603. They end with Queen Elizabeth I, who dies in 1603. Right there. So I will kind of go through. Of course, they do have a lot of monarchs. Of course, we'll get through later. I'll kind of discuss, the other ones like Edward VI, Mary I, who were kind of minor ones that they had. But let me first talk about Henry VIII, who you see more pictures of him right there. Henry VIII, of course, was famously known for starting the English Reformation, which led to the development of the Anglican Church or Church of England, which started in the 1530s. It was created through Acts of Parliament that Henry helped develop with them. And this church later broke away, as I've talked about before, in the Reformation. It was kind of part of the Protestant Reformation, and later it'll kind of evolve into more of a Protestant church, heavily influenced mostly by Calvinism overall. Of course, if you go to Henry VIII's wives, who you see there, basically those are the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And the one at the top left, of course, Catherine of Aragon, had a lot to do with why Henry eventually formed this church, because of the fact that he wanted to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish princess. He lacked a male heir. He had other children, but they had died. So I think the only surviving daughter we'll talk about later was Queen Mary I, who they later nicknamed Bloody Mary. She was the only one that survived. And so he'll kind of try to remarry. At first, that doesn't happen, even though the church rejected it, like the Pope at the time. And so he was forced to basically create his own church. And so what happened was Parliament created the Anglican Church through various acts of Parliament, which I guess the most famous that they created was the Act of Supremacy, where the monarch of Britain or England at the time became the supreme head of the church and the state. So they kind of removed the Pope from power. And he basically now controlled all the church lands, the churches in England. He even forced all the clergy in England to take an oath to this new church that he creates. And at first, it wasn't really Protestant. If you know about his church he formed, it was really more of a quasi-Catholic type church with him at the head of it, which they often call it Henrician Catholicism. And then over time, after he dies, it'll later kind of evolve more into a Protestant church. And one of the things that's famous about the Anglican Church is that they keep a lot of the episcopacy, the bishops in it, which I'll get to later. Some of the actual famous archbishops that are part of it, Archbishop of Canterbury and, of course, the Archbishop of York are, of course, the main ones that are part of it. Of course, at the top, you see there, Anne Boleyn would later be the one that would replace his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So they formed this church. And, of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury, we'll talk about later, basically gets the divorce for him. And so he remarries Anne Boleyn, who was a English noblewoman who was actually the sister of one of Henry's mistresses. a woman named Mary Boleyn. And she would end up later having one daughter with Henry VIII, which will be Queen Elizabeth I. But Anne Boleyn, her marriage to Henry VIII only lasts about 3 years, and she's later executed because she ran out. She basically lost favor with him, and I guess because she failed to produce a male heir, and so he basically got rid of her. Then you have, of course, the third wife, of course, Jane Seymour, who happened, by the way, to be a lady in waiting of Anne Boleyn. That would be one of Henry VIII's favorites. And so she would eventually give Henry his male heir, which will later be Edward VI, who later would become king after Henry dies. But she died from childbirth complications after Edward VI was born. So he was out of basically 3 wives within like 4 years. Then on the bottom left there, you have Anne of Cleves. She was a German princess that he decided to marry. I think he was trying to create some kind of allegiances or alliances with German states that were in Europe. And so she came over and he didn't really like her. And so he never really consummated the marriage. I don't think they ever did anything. It's kind of not really an official marriage, I guess, because of that. But I think it only lasted a few months and he divorced her pretty much after that. I think they still remained friends, but, pretty much that didn't work out. Then Catherine Howard, who was a teenager, by the way, honestly, I forget how old she was. She was a teenager when he married her. He found out she was actually having an affair with a friend of actually Henry VIII's. I believe was a man named Thomas Culpeper, who was actually a distant cousin. And so she was arrested. He divorced her and had her beheaded, basically. And then the last one, so that was Catherine Howard. So yeah, Thomas Culpeper, I think he was killed too for having a relationship with her, Catherine Howard. And then you have, of course, Catherine Parr, the bottom right, of course, there. I kind of put her in white there because she's the only one that really survived out of the 6 wives of Henry VIII. She basically was this divorcee that married him. And she actually survived the marriage because Henry died in 1543 and she lived about 3 or 4 more years afterwards. So I guess she was more happier afterwards when he died. So yeah, there's also this so-called rhyme they always do, as you know, which is the 6 wives of Henry VIII: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. As they say, try to say that real fast with a tongue twister, isn't it? But that's basically the 6 wives of Henry VIII, and kind of like a soap opera. It's kind of what it was, pretty much. Looks like Diamond is joining us, by the way, in StreamYard. But it looks like Trey. Hey, what's up, Trey? What's going on this afternoon? Kind of going over, of course, the British Empire, the rise of it anyway. So, yeah, so kind of that's the 6 wives of Henry VIII. I'm going to, of course, move on. I'll talk about after Henry died. So Henry, he would die in 1547. And, of course, the problem was the throne then went to Edward VI, even though he had these 2 older daughters that he had. They could have gotten it. It went to the male first, as you know. And he'll be the next ruler that'll come in, which I'll show an image of Edward. I think I've got some pictures showing him. He's on the right at the top there, Edward VI. And Edward only reigned about 6 years because he was a sickly child. He came to the throne when he was about 10, died when he was 16. He had tuberculosis, and so he succumbed from that at a young age. But there is one thing I did want to mention about that's important about, of course, Edward, is that under him, really that's when Protestantism really starts taking off. And Edward had this prayer book that they started to develop under his reign, which was called the Book of Common Prayer. It was developed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is Thomas Cranmer. I think I've got an image of Cranmer I can kind of share with you, but Cranmer was the one that pretty much helped develop the church under Henry VIII. He also got pretty much some of the early divorces of Henry VIII and all that. And he was kind of controversial, I know, because later he's actually burnt at the stake by Mary. Mary Tudor comes in later, who doesn't like what Cranmer's trying to do. And so, that going on. And so Protestantism, the whole country starts to go more Protestant at that point under Edward's reign. But, of course, what ends up happening after Edward dies, there's kind of a big controversy that comes in. Edward tries to put in this cousin of his who was a Protestant named Lady Jane Grey. This happened in 1553, like around summer of 1553. And the only thing was, she wasn't next in line to the throne. It was actually her sister, which, of course, you see to the left there, Mary the First. And Lady Jane Grey tried to take power, but what happened was she only lasted 9 days. She was known as the 9 Days Queen, if you know about that, Lady Jane Grey. And so she was overthrown by Mary Tudor, who seized power, and she'll be the ruler of England from 1553 to 1558. She'll have, of course, Lady Jane Grey executed. I think she had first imprisoned her in the Tower of London, but she was not very popular, of course, at all. That's her on the left. She was later known as Bloody Mary, just kind of a nickname or sobriquet that stemmed from the fact that after she became the ruler in England in 1553, she started this counter-reformation to try to turn the country back to being Catholic. It led to a bunch of persecutions that they sometimes call it the Marian persecutions, kind of named after her name. And at one point, she had something like 284 Protestants executed, actually burned at the stake, which they were still doing that in the 16th century, if you know about this. And including Thomas Cranmer, he was actually burned at the stake under her reign. So that's what kind of got her nickname Bloody Mary. Now, of course, later now they talk about Bloody Mary being, a drink. And I think it's also like a game you would play where you would kind of stare at the mirror and turn around a bunch of times. Now, they had this incident that happened I did want to talk about under her. I don't think if I have it in here, but maybe some images I'll kind of show later of the Church of England. I'll get to these things later. But yeah, Canterbury Cathedral, that's one of the main cathedrals, of course, where the Archbishop of Canterbury basically controls the church from. And so he's a very powerful figure. So they have one of two powerful archbishops that are under the monarch, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and of course the Archbishop of York also as well. Also, if you know about it, Westminster Abbey is also big with the church as well. So that's where all the the monarchs, like the king or queens, are usually crowned. Collegiate Church of St. Peter in Westminster, London. It's a very, very famous church, of course, you're looking at right there. But they had this incident that happened, but because of her marriage, she had this marriage she had where she married Prince Philip of Spain, Queen Mary the First. It sparked a bunch of rebellions in the country that were really bloody. In January to February 1554, which occurred in the southeastern part of England. And what ended up happening was they were trying to put, they think it was led by this man named Sir Thomas Wyatt, who was the main leader who was later beheaded for it. And there's a debate about why, what was his point, what he was trying to do. They think that Sir Thomas Wyatt was trying to put on the throne of England a Protestant ruler, and they're not sure. Lady Jane Grey, who was in prison in the Tower of London, Elizabeth, who was also, I think, in prison at that time too, Tower of London as well. They think that Wyatt was going to try to put one of those two in, but Wyatt's rebellion, it failed, and he was executed right after that, more or less. But She was really an unpopular ruler, Queen Mary. Mary would die in 1558 without an heir. There was this rumor going around that she was pregnant. They often call it the so-called phantom pregnancy uh, of um, of Mary the First, but it turned out to be uterine cancer in the end. So she died of cancer, and I think a lot of the Protestants in the country were kind of, thank God she's dead, that kind of thing. And so today, still, Bloody Mary is still not a popular ruler, more or less. Now, I want to get into, of course, the main thing we'll talk about today, which, of course, is Mary's half sister, of course, that will come to power, which is Elizabeth the First, you see in that image. And Elizabeth, of course, was known as the Virgin Queen. Of course, she would reign from 1558 to 1603. Of course, during what they call the so-called Golden Age of England is one of the nicknames they call that period, like late 16th, early 17th century, roughly. Also, it is like often called the Elizabethan era or Elizabethan age as well. It's also part of the Shakespearean era, which occurs kind of like at the end of her reign, at the beginning of King James's reign as well. She also had other nicknames. Sometimes she was called Good Queen Bess, although she could be Bad Queen Bess also as well, because she put to death a lot of people too, as well like Mary did, but she was Protestant though. Of course, she was also called Gloriana, was another nickname she was also dubbed as well. She's considered one of the greatest monarchs in British history. She's the fourth longest reigning. I think it's somewhere like 44, 45 years that she reigned in power. You can see 1558 to 1603, the years of her reign. She's, of course, the last Tudor monarch they have because she had no children. She was a virgin monarch, basically. She never married either, which is kind of controversial, I guess, for that time, more or less. The big things that she did, if you study about her reign, of course, was the so-called Elizabethan religious settlement, which happened between 1558 to 1559, where Parliament got together after Mary died, and they restored the Anglican Church, and they made various reforms to it pretty much. And you can see those are some of the things that were kind of required. They were part of the Anglican Church, which a lot of those you're looking at right there were part of the Act of Uniformity, which was passed in 1559. I'll put it up here on the screen if you want. But what it did, a bunch of things, it reestablished the Book of Common Prayer, which was brought back. They often abbreviate it sometimes as BCP, if you want. Forced all English to go to church, or you had to pay a fine, or I think even imprisonment was a possibility. There was no religious freedom for other Protestant sects or Catholics or anything like that. It was a kind of an attempt to kind of combine Catholicism and Protestantism because they kept some of the Catholic stuff in it, like the icons and things like that, and the bishops and the priests were kind of all kept, etc. But you can see they made changes like priests could marry, and all the masses were in English. Prayer books were in English, and things like that as well. So those are all something different that compared to, say, the Catholic Church or even the Protestant churches, other ones that were kind of around as well. They also passed another act, which was the Act of Supremacy in 1559. And what this one did was it said again that the monarch of Britain, England, was the head of the church and state. But they changed the title. It went from Supreme Head, which had been Henry VIII's title. It became Supreme Governor. And of course, currently, the monarch of Britain today, which is Queen Elizabeth II, is Supreme Governor. So yeah, kind of talking about that. And of course, I showed you earlier the Canterbury Cathedral. That's where the Archbishop of Canterbury has his main seat, of course, in England. Now, Elizabeth had this rival that she had, and really it was their closest heir. which is Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. And she, of course, at one point had been the actual Queen of Scotland, 1547 to 67. Elizabeth did not have any, children. And so she was the next thing to, taking the throne if she were to, die. And that was kind of a worrisome thing because of the fact that, England was going Protestant at that point. And then if you know about Mary Stuart, she was Catholic. So Catholicism was kind of still kind of hanging on in Scotland at the time. She was kind of controversial. If you know about her reign, she was known for being married multiple times. I think she had probably a few lovers on the side as well. And those are three husbands at one point she kind of went through. They had Francis II, who was the king of France, who she married briefly, who died. So basically, she was actually living in France at one point. And then she came back to Scotland and married this, I think, a second cousin named Lord Darnley, also known as Henry Stuart. And the only thing about him, she didn't really like him, and he was a drunk. And there was this other guy named Earl of Bothwell, a Scottish nobleman, James Hepburn. He kind of took a fancy to her, if you know about this. And apparently they believe he may have conspired with Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, to kill her second husband. And then he said, "Hey, I want to marry you on top of that." And so what happened to her, she got implicated in the death of her second husband, Lord Darnley. And it became a big scandal in the country in Scotland. And so actually the Scots at one point put her in prison. They were kind of deciding what they were going to do with her at that point. However, somebody let her out. I think some jailer that kind of liked her or something like that, kind of felt sorry for her. So she fled the country, if you know about this, and eventually went to what is England. And so when she gets to England, she tries to get help from Elizabeth to try to get her throne back in Scotland. And Elizabeth's like, "Hell no, I'm not giving you your throne back," because of the fact that Scotland at that point was also trying to go Protestant as well. They had the so-called, Scottish Reformation that John Knox had started, where they, developed the Church of Scotland or Presbyterianism. And so she didn't really want to put a, Catholic ruler back on the throne of Scotland. And so Elizabeth put her in prison instead, basically in like various castles around the country. And what's really weird is the two never met each other, like Elizabeth and Mary Stuart. And Elizabeth was really, really jealous of Mary Stuart, not just because she might be in line next to the throne, but she thought she was like real pretty, supposedly. I think she was. What happened to Mary Stuart was kind of tragic, but she later got implicated in this assassination conspiracy involving this man named Anthony Babington, who I believe was an English Catholic. And she was arrested for being involved in it, and she was brought to trial in February of 1587 and executed by Elizabeth. So Elizabeth had her head cut off, if you know about that. And they had this guy named William Cecil, who I wanted to mention about. He was a famous spy master that was under Elizabeth. He pretty much practically started the whole Secret Service thing in England that the British are famous for later. He's also a chief advisor to Elizabeth I, and he's the one that uncovered it pretty much overall. So that's pretty much what happened with Elizabeth. She with Mary. Pretty much Mary was killed off at that point. And so, but I'll get to it later. Mary Stuart will get revenge. She'll have a son, if you know about that, named James. It becomes James VI of Scotland. And so he'll later become the King of England because he's next in line. So I'll be like a second cousin of Elizabeth, basically, that will happen. Now, I'll get to next and talk about the other thing that happened too under Elizabeth, which they had this conflict that happened with Mary, with the not with Mary. Well, it actually was caused by Mary. Mary Stuart's death, they think, ends up causing a lot of conflicts between England and Spain. And it'll later lead to the fact that the Spanish try to invade, tackle the Spanish Armada, if you know about that. That occurs. I did want to talk about, I'll get to the Sea Dogs in a second overall, of course, right there. But the Sea Dogs, if you study about them, that's one of the things we need to kind of get to. They had this Anglo-Spanish conflict that broke out under Elizabeth. It's often called the Anglo-Spanish War from about 1585 to 1604. Both those countries, England and Spain, fought for supremacy, not just in part of like Western Europe or whatever, but in the Atlantic Ocean and also in the Pacific a little bit as well, which will be later. And you get these Sea Dogs that they're called. These Sea Dogs were these privateers, like the list of them right here that are kind of famous. They would go after a lot of the Spanish galleons, which were bringing up gold and silver into from Latin America after the conquest of America. Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir John Hawkins, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. Those are the main ones that were really the most famous that they had. And of course, the one I just showed you, where was it? Of course, the one at there's all three of them right there. You can see Sir Francis Drake, top right, Sir Walter Raleigh, kind of in the middle, Sir John Hawkins, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, which I think Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert were both like half brothers of each other overall. But Drake was really the most famous one that was, of course, well known. Drake was very famous for his circumnavigation of the world, which he did between 1577 to 1580. There, of course, is his famous ship there, which is a replica of the so-called HMS Golden Hind, which was one of the ships that was involved in the journey around the world. Yeah, Drake is one of the first to successfully circumnavigate without dying, because if you remember correctly, Magellan had died, halfway around the world. You can see the route he took, which was kind of similar to what Magellan had taken in the early 16th century. But I think the only thing different he did, which I think that map kind of gets wrong, is that he does sail. He doesn't really go through the Strait of Magellan. He goes around it, which is the Cape Horn, which is the bottom of South America. He sails all the way up there to California at one point, close to where almost Canada and Alaska is. And you can see sails across the Pacific and then through the Indian Ocean. So obviously this was part of an expedition that was kind of planned. But Drake, as he sailed around the world, would basically take Spanish ships, and he was called the often called the Dragon or El Drake by the Spanish because he was known for burning a lot of their ships when he would take them. Drake also Sir John Hawkins were involved in the defeat of the Spanish Armada, which happened in 1588. Of course, a major event early on, in the rise of the British Empire. If you know about this, in August 1588, the Spanish under King Philip II decided to invade. He was pretty angry about the fact that Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had been executed. I think he also had some kind of tentative claim to the throne because he had been married to Elizabeth's half-sister, which, Mary, Bloody Mary, of course. He had been, her husband originally. And so he formed this huge armada, which you can see had 130 ships in it. And they were going to try to invade England and try to take it. And obviously, Philip's main goal was to try to reconvert England to being Catholic, because Philip II was a big proponent of the Counter-Reformation. It was often called the Invincible Armada, if you know about that. They thought it was invincible, that kind of thing. And I think I've got an image showing the map of it. But if you go here to this map right here with the two people, there's, of course, Philip II on the right. The actual fleet was commanded by this man named Alonso Perez, who's the Duke of Medina Sidonia. And besides 130 ships, it also included military forces that were going to land on the southern coast of England and then take it, I guess, and maybe the throne, I guess. They had the idea for that. And you can see the route that the Spanish Armada took as it ran through the English Channel in the numerous battles that were involved. Predominantly, this happened in late July, early August is when it occurred. And a smaller English navy defeated the Spanish Armada, which part of it was due to battles, but they think that bad weather kind of played a major role in why the English won. The Royal Navy, like storms, English Channel is known for its bad weather, bad storms, and things like that. I think the old saying was that the weather vane was blowing in the right direction for their cannon. And so it forced eventually the Spanish fleet, you can see there, to sail up into the North Sea. They pretty much got scattered. And if you go to this map here, you can see how the Spanish had to actually sail around Scotland and Ireland to get back to Spain. And they end up losing, I think, close to half their fleet. So the defeat of the Spanish Armada was a major turning point in European history. England, after that, starts to become a major power in Western Europe. And it's going to later lead to them being able to colonize part of the world. And so that's going to eventually lead to the rise of the British Empire, and all that in the next century that you'll have. Yeah, Elizabeth, that was her peak. If you know about, 1588, that year, she was known for her famous speech that she gave on August the 19th, 1588. It's often called the speech to the troops at Tilbury to kind of, I guess, boost their morale. She said famously, I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of the King of England. And of course, her famous quote there. But after that, she couldn't top that. If you know about the end of her reign, pretty much. But from there, it's going to go up, downhill for them. Eventually becoming a major power after her reign. Of course, they always talk about her death. She actually died at 69 years old. She was pretty old, so reigning almost, not quite 45, but almost 45 years that she was in power. The throne would go to her second cousin, James VI of Scotland, who had been reigning for years, I think since 1567. And so he'll come over and become the King of England as James I. And so, in the end, I guess Mary Stuart got her revenge. Hurrah, in the end, because, her son ends up on the throne, What killed Elizabeth? There's kind of a debate about that, like what killed her. I think they didn't really do an autopsy on her after she died, or post-mortem thing. They think lead poisoning could have been part of why she died. They wore a lot of this whitish makeup, which they think had lead in it. Cancer has been also speculated, or a stroke. But she was just pretty darn old, at that time, almost 70. But back then that's pretty old for that time. So mostly almost like natural causes is pretty much what killed her. Right, I'm going to move on, of course. I am going to talk a little about William Shakespeare, who actually was considered to be one of the greatest playwrights in pretty much British history, or any history overall. I do have a little short video. I'll kind of just show you a little bit on who William Shakespeare was. So let me just kind of show you that real quick.
William Shakespeare, one of the greatest authors of all time, was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. His actual birth date is uncertain, but most scholars believe he was born on or near April 23, 1564.
We think he may have been educated in the King's School at Stratford because that would have been typical for a child with a father who was an alderman. What we do know is that he didn't go to university.
We have a marriage record for Shakespeare to Anne Hathaway in 1585. We also have baptism records for a daughter and a set of twins. And we also know that his son, Hamnet, one of the twins, died.
Shakespeare moved to London in the late 1580s. By the early 1590s, we know he's writing, and we know that he's acting.
By 1597, Shakespeare had authored 15 of the 37 plays attributed to him, including Romeo and Juliet, Comedy of Errors, and The Merry Wives of Windsor.
People think of William Shakespeare as an artist, a playwright. He was a pretty good businessman.
In 1599, he built the largest open-air amphitheater in London, the Globe Theatre.
He was an entrepreneur, he knew his market, he knew how to cater to that market, he made shrewd real estate investments.
Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, changed its name to the King's Men when King James became its patron in 1603. This was a mark of exceptional prestige.
The different types of Shakespeare plays, they're separated into histories, comedies, tragedies, and then later on tragicomedies.
Shakespeare's phrases, the ways he used words, are so common that people often get mixed up and can't remember if they came from the Bible or from Shakespeare. My grandmother used to say, when something bad happened, that these were the slings and arrows of everyday life. She was not an educated woman, and she didn't go to Shakespeare plays. She didn't get that one from the Bible.
What scholars call Shakespeare's middle period, from 1595 to 1605, included such classic comedies as Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, and Much Ado About Nothing. He also produced Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth during this period.
Right at the cusp where Shakespeare begins to write Lear, it tips into what we could call the later Shakespeare. And this period produces Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, Tempest, Winter's Tale, Pericles, Cymbeline.
Shakespeare wrote great stories. For example, one of the stories starts with a king who is tired. He doesn't want to govern anymore. So he says to his three daughters, I'm going to separate the kingdom between the three of you, but it's going to be based on who tells me how much they love me. However much you love me, that's how much of the kingdom you're going to get. Now that's going to make me sit up. I mean, what a way to start a story. And that's King Lear.
Shakespeare was not only a playwright, he also was a poet, partly because of economic necessity. During the early 1590s, plague closed the theaters in London, and there was quite a vogue for producing sonnets.
Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, in addition to several narrative poems.
Shakespeare worked the English language, milked it for all it was worth, made up words if it didn't give him the right words. He is one of the first professional writers.
The details of William Shakespeare's death remain a mystery, but scholars believe he died on his birthday, April 23, 1616. In the 400 years since, Shakespeare's influence has only grown. His writing is the second most quoted after the Bible. He has been credited with introducing almost 3,000 words to the English language, and a Google search on Shakespeare returns more than 140 million results.
Shakespeare talked about the human condition. He explains to us how we think, how we feel, the human psyche. He eloquently explains it.
In the 18th century, questions arose about the authorship of Shakespeare's work, given the vague details we know of his life, his lack of higher education, and the similarity of his plays to others of the day. Today, most scholars believe Shakespeare wrote all his plays and sonnets.
I would argue that Shakespeare's legacy is the most influential figure in human civilization.
Mark Twain is now thought of as America's first celebrity because he was so good at capturing the public imagination, and it became important to him to have a public image.
Well, a short little video there, of course, on William Shakespeare, of course, the Bard of Avon, they often called him, of course, who wrote all those famous plays you can see, of course, Romeo and Juliet, Merchant of Venice, Julius Caesar, Midsummer's Night's Dream, Henry IV, Henry V, Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night, Hamlet, and of course, much more. Not just plays, but he was also a writer of poetry, like sonnets and things like that as well. And of course, you can see he was known for his so-called Globe Theater, which there actually were two at one point because one burned down in London. And so, William Shakespeare is definitely considered one of the greatest, not just playwright, but greatest writers of all time in literature. All right, I'm going to move on, of course, next to we'll kind of get into and talk about the Stuart Dynasty because they take over as well England and reign over what's the early part of the British Empire as well. Of course, I'll get to talk about the House of Stuart, at least the English aspect of it that controls it from Scotland that take over. But you can see all the different monarchs. You have James the First, who's the first one that comes in. His son Charles I, his son Charles II, and then Charles II has got his brother James II. They're brothers, those two. And then you've also got, of course, William and Mary, who reigned later, and then Queen Anne. It's all the different Stuarts that actually control England. But Stuart Dynasty, goes back to Scotland. They had reigned before and all that. And but King James, the one we're going to talk about today, was now known as really James the First the most, of course, is the first ruler of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, with the Stuarts taking control. And I told you how, James was the son of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, who, Elizabeth had executed back in the 1580s. And so he had been on the throne a long time. And if you study about James, he had been the king of Scotland for like 57 years, 1567, 1625. And then, of course, later he came over to be the king of England, you can see, which he reigned from 1603 to 1625 that you have. So basically, his reign follows next. He did have two children I'll kind of briefly talk about through his main wife and consort, queen consort, Anne of Denmark, King Charles, who's probably the most famous one I'll get to later because of the English Civil War, and then Elizabeth Stuart, who was later Queen of Bohemia, who married this German nobleman in basically Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. Now, I'll kind of talk about major events that were big under James. When he first came in, they had this incident, 1605, that was called the Gunpowder Plot. It's kind of this Catholic conspiracy that took place in the country where they were trying to basically put what is James's daughter on the throne, which was Elizabeth Stuart. So a bunch of Catholics were involved. And so it happened in November. November 8th is when they actually caught the conspirators. And I'll get to Guy Fawkes Day, which happens later. But apparently it was caught by Robert Cecil, who was an advisor and who also ran like the Secret Service under King James. I think we talked about William Cecil. That was basically the son of William Cecil, who had been an advisor under Elizabeth. He's the one who uncovered the plot itself. And a bunch of people were arrested for it, which I think there's two main men that they always talk about the most, which were famous, which were Robert Catesby and then also Guy Fawkes, who, by the way, was one of the main conspirators that was caught with the actual gunpowder barrels, so-called gunpowder treason and plot. And they were actually going to use gunpowder to basically blow up Parliament when the king came to make a speech and open Parliament. And so Fawkes was caught. Robert Catesby, though, he and a bunch of other men got killed in a gun battle. And so they prevented the assassination from happening. November 5th, 1605 is the actual date of when the gunpowder plot was. They now have what they call Guy Fawkes Day. It's sometimes also called Bonfire Night as well. Every year on November 5th, they kind of celebrate the anniversary, of basically the fact that the monarch wasn't killed. So it's kind of a celebration. The 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. Yeah, remember the 5th of November. Of course, the rhyming thing they would say. That's kind of a famous thing that happened, but you obviously had those that were in the country that didn't like James, and they wanted to put like a Catholic ruler in power. James was known for other things. One of the things he did that's very, very famous, if you know about it, he was one of the first British rulers to successfully colonize, because Elizabeth had tried to colonize like part of like the east coast of Virginia, about the Roanoke Island. That didn't work out. Roanoke Island, or Newfoundland, I think, was another area that the British tried to colonize as well. But those were the most famous that he colonized. One was Jamestown, which began one of the first American colonies in Virginia. That would be, as you know, Virginia would be later part of the British 13 colonies. That'll control the east coast of where the United States is. That was established, of course, in 1607, which was actually granted through a charter through a company called the Virginia Company. Mostly they went there to try to see if they could find gold, like the Spanish were doing. But I think in the end, the colony will survive later because of the development of tobacco and agricultural things. They also had the Northern Ireland. That was another thing too that's very famous under James. The plantation of Ulster. That's something you always hear about. That's kind of famous as well. And so in Northern Ireland, they basically, the English tried to colonize that area as well, which was mostly colonized by people that were from England, or also those that were Scots, and like mostly part of southern central Scotland. And the ones that were from Scotland were known as the Scotch Irish. That would kind of go in there, like where Ulster is today. And primarily they did it to develop agriculture there, like in Ireland. But the other thing reason why they colonized Northern Ireland, they were trying to convert the Irish to being Protestant was one reason. And then also they were trying to get the Irish to become more like the English, even adopt the English language and things like that as well. I think I would go back here. Bermuda, which I think was in 1609, was another colony. It was in the Central Atlantic. They also created as well. So those are the main things he would colonize: Jamestown, Northern Ireland, which was called originally the Plantation of Ulster, and of course Bermuda. Also, I'll kind of mention this, which is very famous, about King James. He helped develop one of the first major English Bibles, which is the King James Bible, or King James Version of the Bible, which came out in 1611. This particular Bible was a type of a Bible that was gotten from translations of basically the Greek translation for the New Testament, and Old Testament came from mostly Hebrew translations, which were developed, of course, through the members of the Anglican Church. And so this Bible, of course, not the first English Bible. There was a couple before that, the Tyndale Bible, and I think they also had a Bible that was under Henry VIII as well, like the third one. This one became the one that's more popular and still around today. And it's, of course, known for its Old English being used, like thee, thy, thou, and those kind of sayings. I'm going to, of course, get to the English Civil War. We'll kind of talk about that in a second, which, breaks out under, King Charles I. But before Charles came in, James grew ill, like at the end of his reign, like in the last few years in the 1620s. And there was a man named the Duke of Buckingham. He was known as George Villiers. He actually ran the court of King James. And he was the regent to Charles I. So you see in that image, he was kind of young at the time. And so I guess James's reign is marked with his decline at that time. And there were, by the way, rumors about King James that he was, I don't know the word gay is the word, but they think he was bisexual. And there's a theory that the Duke of Buckingham was actually a lover of his. But there you go. You got, of course, King Charles I, who would come in. Charles I was the second Stuart monarch. He'll reign, you can see, 1625 to 1649. What is he famous for? Charles is the one that is famous for getting the country into the English Civil War, which will later break out at the end of his reign in the 1642, to be exact. The English Civil War, by the way, was not really a conflict which was fought over really, who the monarch was. It had nothing to do with that. It was more like, you can see there, where they rejected the idea of divine right monarchy. So they basically felt like they wanted more of a limited monarchy where the parliament has the power, to rule over the country and all that. And that's what really the war was really about, more than anything. He was controversial. King Charles, along with James, had these views that were like, they kind of believed in divine right theory, which they think was influenced by the French, like the French Bourbons and all that. But he had a lot of conflicts with Parliament, where he closed down Parliament several times. And then on top of that, he was married to a Catholic woman, Henrietta Maria, who was the daughter of King Henry IV of France. She was actually the sister of King Louis XIII. And also, if you want to know, she was also the aunt later on of Louis XIV. You, of course, have heard of the famous Sun King as well. So a lot of these, especially the children of the Stuarts after Charles, were actually partially related to the Bourbons. They have some, lineage there, which is kind of controversial with that and all that. But Parliament really wanted more of a limited monarchy, and Charles wanted to be more like an absolutist. That kind of created loggerheads that later led to eventually the war breaking out. What happened was in 1628, they felt like the king was getting too powerful, and so they issued this act of Parliament, which became known as the Petition of Right. And what the Petition of Right was an attempt to do, it was an attempt to try and limit the powers of King Charles. You can see it said several things that was in the actual Parliamentarian Act. It said no tax without consent of Parliament, no imprisonment without trial, no quartering of soldiers, no martial law in time of peace. So these are all things that supposedly King Charles was trying to do. He was trying to behave like an absolute monarch, like James had tried to do, by the way, previously. And at first he agreed to the petition that they issued, and then he broke his word, if you know about that, on 1629. And he responded by abolishing Parliament, which he did between 1629 to 1640, the so-called, they call it the 11 years tyranny, the personal rule of King Charles I. And so at that point, he's trying to reign as an absolutist in the country. And so this is going to eventually lead to, the English Civil War eventually breaking out in the country because of these issues. So struggles of Parliament are really a big problem, of course. And then what happened, though, was a bunch of conflicts broke out in Europe, which made things very difficult, for Charles to get revenue to fight wars. Which Parliament controls a lot of the purse strings taxation. And so what happened was in 1640, Charles recalled Parliament, finally, after about 11 years. And they had two conflicts that broke out. They had one, which was the Bishops' Wars in Scotland. The Scots, who were trying to go, Presbyterian, like Protestant, they didn't want to have bishops, like episcopacy, like, archbishops and priests. And they wanted the presbyters, these church elders that ran the Church of Scotland. And so they got in a war over it, if you know about this, 1639, 1640. And so you had to get money for that. And in 1640, they had the war, the Austrian succession broke out when Frederick the Great invaded Austria. So it's like these wars. And so what happened was England supported Maria Theresa and, Holy Roman Empire, all that. And so he needed money to fight in this war. And so he summoned actually Parliament at one point, which he did twice. The way, if you know about this, first in May of 1640, he summoned what became known as the so-called Short Parliament. It was called that because it only sat for like 3 weeks, basically. I think it was like 3 weeks, a few weeks. That was about it. Then he dissolved it because he wasn't happy with what they were trying to do. And then he called the so-called Long Parliament right after that. And that parliament supposedly sat for 20 years. And that's why it's called that, the so-called Long Parliament. And it's really the Long Parliament that really causes all the problems for him. What it was, the Long Parliament was full of a lot of members. A lot of the majority members that were in Parliament by that time in the 1640s were what they call Puritans. Puritans were these Anglicans that were Reformed theology. They wanted to be like pure Calvinists. They wanted to basically kick out any kind of elements of the Catholic faith that's in the Anglican Church, Church of England, and make it more Protestant instead of Catholic. And so they didn't really like what he was trying to do with the country. They also didn't like the fact that he was trying to be an absolutist as well. And so that's what caused the Civil War to break out. In fact, at one point, what happened was Charles even sent troops into Parliament to arrest members of Parliament that were against him, and it caused the war to break out into a civil war. So the Civil War itself will last a bunch of years. I'll kind of get to the sides that are really in the war. Not yet about that. But the Civil War itself has got different names. It wasn't really one civil war. If you know about the English Civil War, it was actually 3 civil wars, kind of all balled into one. And it didn't just encompass England. It encompassed like Scotland. It even went over into Ireland as well. And so a lot of times in Britain, they'll call it sometimes the War of the Three Kingdoms. Some people even call it the English or British Civil Wars as well. It's kind of like we say America. We say Civil War over here, but they kind of talk about our Civil War. They'll say American Civil War. The kind of difference between theirs or whatever. That's something that's often quite done because of that. So yeah, you get this deal where they have opposing sides that are against each other in the war. On one side, you can see you've got the Cavaliers fighting, and then the other side is the Roundheads. I'll kind of explain the differences between the two groups that are fighting in the war. The Cavaliers were basically supporters of the monarch, Charles I. They were known as royalists, which is the common term that they used, but the Roundheads, parliamentarian side, of course, called them the Cavaliers because it was kind of like a snickering, nickname to give to them because they were considered the upper classes or whatever. And they had different commanders under them, like Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who was mostly the cavalry commander under Charles I. He was actually a nephew of Charles, and he basically was the one that was like the one that commanded the cavalry. And then Charles II, who later became king, was also a general that was under Charles, which was his son. So the Roundheads were mostly those that were, a lot of them were Puritans, but many of them were like middle class, type people that were involved. And a lot of the Puritans controlled a lot of the officers, like in the actual armies that they would set up later. They're called grandees sometimes, which I think was a Spanish term that they kind of adopted. But they had two generals that were real famous under the Roundheads, parliamentarian armies. They had Oliver Cromwell, who later, would be like really their best general. He was a member of Parliament, and Cromwell was mostly a cavalry commander in the war. And a lot of people think he was really the best general overall. But Sir Thomas Fairfax, who they later called Black Tom, it was kind of a nickname he was called because he had a dark complexion. Black Tom, Sir Thomas Fairfax, was really that guy that was the actual commander of the parliamentarian forces, which were later given a nickname, if you know about it. It was called the New Model Army. That was the parliamentarian army, which formed, by the way, in 1645. And the parliamentarian army was an English professional army, one of its first kind, and I guess in modern times, which especially used like muskets and things like that and cannon. This army fought everywhere. It fought pretty much in England, it fought in Scotland, and even at one point invaded Ireland. And so before that, a lot of armies were more local, that kind of thing, almost more medieval. And it's more of a modernized type army, professional one, which used all kinds of new kinds of weapons that they used in the war. Kind of look at things, but a lot of the infantry used pikes, believe it or not, in battle, which were used to stop cavalry, overall. And then another thing, too, is they start using muskets a lot. Muskets start coming in to a lot of wars by the 17th century. You see that a lot. They had different kinds of muskets that were in use. Commonly, they had the matchlock musket, one of the first they had. But the only thing about it was if it's raining, the might go out, your wick to set off the charge. Basically, a lot of people would put the thing under their hat or something like that to basically prevent it from getting wet. And then the wheel lock, of course, musket, which was really, I guess, the early variation of the flintlock. I think they sometimes call it the dog lock also as well. That was also used a lot. And then cannon, too. They started using cannon a lot, too, in the 17th century. And that firepower, things like that, use of cannon was really, in the end, the thing that'll help the parliamentarian New Model Army win a lot of battles overall. So I'm going to get later into kind of stop today. I know part one lecture, but I'll talk more about the English Civil War later in the week. I think on Wednesday, I'll kind of talk about how the parliamentarian side wins, like the New Model Army wins the war. Oliver Cromwell seized power. He takes over. They called him Old Ironsides originally, or the Lord Protector. He'll kind of take over the country. We'll talk about Richard Cromwell, and then we'll kind of talk how the Stuarts are restored to power, different ones that come in, Charles II, James II, William and Mary, Queen Anne. Then I'll get into the later part of the empire, British Empire, which really starts to take off around the 18th century. I'll kind of talk about, I guess, up to Queen Victoria, and I'll kind of go into some of the later rulers up to the Windsors as well. But this lecture series is more about the rise of the British Empire more than the main one later. That'll develop by the 19th century. So that's it for today. Before y'all go, I did want to remind you about a bunch of assignments I'll have out right now. Y'all do have, that exploration quiz, which I think is coming up pretty much due this week. Conquest of America, that one's coming due as well. And then first exam will be due probably, next week. I know that. It'll probably be pushed back a few days. And then you do have a bonus quiz that go along with the first exam because most of you, like I said, will only get one attempt for it overall. Before I go, I did want to share with you the actual real national anthem of the British. I know we had that one. I kind of, if you go back to the beginning, I kind of did that one by the Sex Pistols, which was kind of very controversial, by the way. They got banned at one point by the BBC. It doesn't really follow the actual lyrics of the actual thing. I know the title does and all that, but I'll actually kind of play the actual national anthem of Britain. I'll see y'all later, by the way.